Last Sam's Cage by David A. Poulsen. Chapter 10, page 105. Eddie lost track of how long he walked. He made his way slowly and aimlessly through the neighborhood. A couple of times he realized he was making a second or even third trip up the same street. He had intended to check out the infill on his way back to the zoo, the one he planned to break into later. But after his visit to Jack Sim's house, he didn't feel like doing much of anything. He did eat the banana, mostly because he was starving, but he didn't enjoy it. He wished now he hadn't taken it. Somehow taking something even as significant as one lousy banana from Jack Sim seemed as wrong as anything Eddie had ever done in his life. He finally decided not to go straight back to the zoo. He wanted to do some thinking, and he wanted to do it somewhere other than where he had spent almost all of his time since he'd run away. He remembered that there was a little strip mall not far. He'd walk there and rip off something to eat or pay for it if he had to, but he wanted something good. Not good like in good for you, just good. Ice cream, maybe. Yeah, maybe a fudgesicle. He'd loved those when he was a little kid, and he couldn't remember the last time he'd had one. He tried to think as he walked, but he wasn't sure what he wanted to think about. How could a person even begin to understand what Jack Sim must have felt when his sister was murdered? One of the newspaper clippings had said Jack was 12 at the time of the murder, 12 years old. Eddie tried to remember back to when he was 12. That was 3 years ago, too long ago to remember a lot of it. But he was 12 when he did the first B&E. No, he was pretty sure he was 13. What was he like when he was 12? He couldn't say for sure, but he thought he still believed that things were going to get better in his life. That all the bad stuff was just temporary. Oh yeah, and he still thought he would play in the NHL. He'd been wrong about both those things. Life didn't get better, it got worse, and as for the NHL, he didn't even play hockey anymore. He'd quit the year after Steve moved in. It wasn't a whole lot of fun hearing your substitute old man yelling at you from the bleachers if you messed up on the ice. Eddie wondered what Jack was like when he was 12. Whatever kind of person he had been, whatever he thought about, whatever his dreams were, Eddie figured it all must have changed completely after what happened at the zoo. But he still didn't understand why Jack came to the zoo every day. But what was that all about? Was it some kind of tribute to his little sister? Some promise he'd made to himself not to forget her? Even if that was it, which would be weird enough after all these years, how did watching little kids at the playground fit in? Ahead, the lights of the strip mall came into view. Eddie was glad. Thinking about all of this was giving him a headache. He decided to concentrate on how good the fudgesicle would taste, but even that thought didn't cheer him up. He knew he was down to less than $2, and if he couldn't steal it, the fudgesicle would take close to half of that. As he crossed the parking lot to the gaudily lit convenience store, he caught a break. Not a big break, but they all counted. There was a quarter lying on the pavement. He scooped it up and dropped it into his pocket. Now even if the clerk was more alert than most, at least part of the fudgesicle's cost was covered. Eddie shook his head. This is nuts, he said out loud. I'm getting excited about finding a lousy quarter, for God's sake. He looked around to see if anyone was close enough to hear him talking to himself. No one was, and he opened the door and stepped into the store. "Hey, how you doing?" A much too cheery clerk with acne and Lyle Lovett hair greeted him. The clerk didn't look much older than Eddie. Eddie managed a weak smile. "Okay," he said, except for the clerk. Eddie was the only one in the store. He looked out into the parking lot. No one else on their way in. No one to distract the clerk. He wouldn't be able to rip off the ice cream. He went to the freezer and pulled a fudgesicle from a cardboard box that had only 3 left. The fudgesicle seemed smaller than Eddie remembered. He took it to the counter and paid without bothering to return the clerk's happy grin. Eddie walked out into the parking lot and removed the wrapper. He stared at the frost-covered ice cream. He was sure now there was a lot less to a fudgesicle than there used to be. More cutbacks. He dropped the wrapper in a happy-faced garbage can. After all the stuff he'd done and all the trouble he'd been in, Eddie had never been able to shake the messages his grade 1 and 2 teachers had drilled into him about littering. He ate slowly, wanting to make the moment last. It was a cool day, so at least he didn't have to worry about the fudgesicle melting. He started down the sidewalk of the strip mall and stopped in front of a used furniture store with a television set playing in the front window. There was a speaker hooked up to the outside of the store, so Eddie decided to watch for a while. It had been a long time since he'd seen any TV. It looked like the news was on. A female reporter was interviewing 2 guys. They both looked familiar to Eddie. They were talking about the economy. An election had been called. Eddie had seen that in the newspaper someone had left behind at the zoo. And these 2 men were candidates. The first guy's name on the screen below his face, the Honorable Arthur Hubley. He was already in government, a hotshot cabinet minister who was close to the premier. Eddie remembered that Hubley and had been some kind of television evangelist. Before he got into politics, he appeared to be right at home looking into the camera. Bringing the deficit under control was God's will and the will of the electorate. Hubley smoothed his tie as he talked. There were pictures of clouds and birds on the tie. A few left-wing whiners have complained about what we've done, but we're not in government to serve whiners and special interest groups, and here's something else you should know. For every complaint that comes in, my office receives at least 3 calls complimenting this government on its record of fiscal responsibility. The reporter looked at the second man. It's been said by some that business is the biggest benefactor of the government's current fiscal policy, and that those with average and low incomes have been made to suffer. As a candidate in the upcoming election, how would you answer a charge like that? The man changed positions a couple of times before speaking. I am among those who have applauded the government for eliminating waste and holding the line on spending. Everybody, and I do mean everybody, should be willing to make some sacrifice so that this province and this country can get their financial houses in order. Below the man's face, his name appeared on the screen. Wallace Pigler, financial consultant. Eddie almost dropped what was left of the fudgesicle. Pigler. Sure, Eddie remembered him now. He'd seen him on TV before. This was Stink Pigler's old man. Eddie could see the resemblance. The features were similar, and the meanness that showed in Stink's eyes was in his father's too. Eddie had to admit that Stink's dad had it all over his kid in the dental department, though. Pigler looked like a little uncomfortable as the reporter asked him to detail the financial sacrifices big businesses had made. She made the point that many corporations had downsized and maintained or increased their profits while eliminating the jobs of hundreds of employees and increasing the workloads of others. Pegler looked into the camera and then just slightly away. Business has had to do its part in fighting the deficit battle. We are fortunate to have a government that showed us the way, and if I'm elected, I will be proud to be a part of that continuing effort, he said. Eddie pointed to his fudgesicle at the TV. Mr. Pegler, he said aloud. Now I know why your kid is such an asshole. It was getting late, and Eddie thought he better start back to the zoo. On the way, he'd go by the infill. He couldn't put it off any longer. He walked faster now. It helped him to stay warm as the evening air cooled. With the setting of the sun on the western horizon, it was behind the skyscrapers of downtown Calgary now, and Eddie cursed himself for not bringing his new ski jacket. When he got to the street, he slowed his pace. The house was the fourth one from the corner. The metallic gray Jeep Cherokee was in the driveway. The living room drapes were open and the light was on. Eddie allowed himself a little smile. It was like these people were inviting him to do their place. They were certainly being helpful. He could see the living room and the hallway he guessed led to the kitchen. No one was in the living room, although the television was on, and Eddie was able to take his time. The whole house had the look of money about it. That was good, very good. No point in going to the trouble of a break-in if there wasn't the promise of a reasonable reward for the effort. As he walked slowly past the house, he looked back and saw a window, probably the kitchen. There was no corresponding window in the house next door, which made it a good candidate for his entrance. At the end of the block, he turned and walked to the alley that ran behind the house. He didn't go far into the alley. That was too risky. He walked along just enough to see the backyard and to make a mental inventory of what he saw. No garage, a couple of small trees, a kid's swing set and a deck with a barbecue, and a couple of lawn chairs. Nothing that would offer cover, which brought Eddie back to the conclusion that the side window was his best bet. He could be seen from the street, but only if someone going by actually turned and looked at that exact spot, and he wouldn't be there long. The kitchen window was off the ground a few feet, but here again the people living in the house were proving to be good hosts. A metal stepladder lay against the far end of the desk. It always surprised him how many people left ladders in plain sight. He'd learned early that this was one of the first things a B&E artist looked for. There was just one more thing to check out, and he wouldn't be able to do that tonight. The swing set meant little kids lived in the house. He'd have to make sure there wasn't a babysitter at the house during the day, or a stay-at-home dad. Eddie had seen the woman leave for work in the Jeep, but that was later in the morning. He hadn't seen any signs of life around the place after she'd left, but he'd have to make sure. He didn't want to drop through that window only to find herself face to face with a terrified babysitter or a large husband with a crowbar. He was finished. He hated the term casing the joint. It sounded too gangster movie-ish. He preferred the term reconnaissance. Anyway, he was finished with the house for now. He decided he would move on the place in 3 days. That would be Friday, which was good. Friday was his lucky day. He based that conclusion on more than just superstition. Not much bad stuff had happened to him on Fridays. He'd even kept a chart of when he got beat up by Steve, and it happened less on Friday than on any other day of the week. It had been a tough day, and suddenly Eddie felt as tired as he had in a long time. He hadn't been able to get the pictures he'd seen in Jack Sim's bedroom out of his head. As he retracted his steps back to the zoo, careful to keep his head down just in case the cops drove by, he thought about death. It seemed to Eddie that there had been some awful whole lot of death in his life so far. When he was in grade 5, 2 of his school classmates died only a couple months apart. One had some rare form of cancer, the other was killed in a car accident. The second kid's older sister had an aunt who was driving the car were killed too. They were hit by a drunk driver who ran a stop sign. The newspaper said the guy was going over 120 clicks on a residential street when he broadsided them. And while lots of kids had 2 sets of grandparents, or at least one, Eddie didn't have any. They'd all died when Eddie was small, and now there was this thing with Jack Sim's little sister. Sometimes it seemed to Eddie that death was all around him. Of course, the death Eddie thought about most often was his dad's. He thought about it again right then, and he wished the same thing he did every time he remembered his dad's dying. Eddie wished that of all the people he knew who had died, he could have just one, even for a day.